All right, so today, of course, we continue our look at this first section of our look at romantic fiction. And what was our theme again for this first section? We saw it with our first protagonist, our first character from The Telltale Heart, and he was kind of crazy. So what was that theme? Folly and Madness, right? So they're not quite the same thing, are they? Right? Madness means to, like in our first story, to be really crazy, right? To be really mad, to be totally irrational, even though we saw that Edgar Allan Poe in that story, he complicates that question by showing that even a madman, like in The Telltale Heart, can also have a rational, logical, calm side to his character as well, right? Is Rip Van Winkle a madman? Is he crazy? No, right? But remember, the other term that's there is that of folly, which means to be foolish, doesn't it? Is he a fool? Yeah, he's not the smartest person around, all right? So within those kinds of romantic characters that we're seeing, the more extreme kind of characters that we see are what we see like in The Telltale Heart, right? Where we have someone who is clearly very crazy, very irrational, you know, kills an old man even though he says he loves him, says that he's not crazy, he's calm and rational even though he does crazy things. And of course, ultimately his actions lead him to murder, right? And even though he says it was a rational thing for him to do. Whereas our story here today is a little bit different, right? It doesn't have those kinds of extremes of passion, and it has some other characteristics about it that we'll see are common to Washington Irving's stories, because of course, much later in this course, in our Vengeance section, we'll read a couple more of Irving's stories. His most famous story, as well as this one, is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, so we will read that one and The Spectre Bridegroom, both of which have very similar kinds of elements, but also not only have certain romantic elements to them, as we'd expect, but also certain things that start to undermine or critique some of those romantic ideas. So we'll see what they are in a moment. All right, so let's quickly go over what happens in this story, so we're all clear about that surface story, and then we can start to use some of the tools that we learned about the last couple of classes in order to try to understand what Irving is doing with this story, okay? So the story, of course, is set where? What country? It's America, right? And of course, when we talk about context in a moment, Irving is from America, right? He is an American writer. So, the story takes place in America, and we have this, I guess he'd be middle-aged man, Rip Van Winkle, who is married to a very demanding wife, right? And he is someone who is not, it says, we're told that he's not exactly lazy because he likes to do lots of work that is like he'll go fishing and he'll help other people and he'll work on all sorts of other things except for the things that he's supposed to be working on, right? So his farm and his household and all the things that are connected to his own profit, he doesn't work on those. Instead, he spends all of his time either in things that are idle pursuits or in helping other people, all right? So we get sort of given this sketch of this character, right, of who he is. His wife is always telling him off, but how does the rest of the village see him? Do they tell him off too? No, he's kind of popular, right? Because he's so helpful and he's so laid back and he's such a sort of fun, easygoing sort of character that most of the other townspeople like him. And in particular, we see there's that sort of the group of the older men who hang out at this one inn and they sort of discuss the matters of the day. And that's where he sometimes goes to to escape. But one day, he is not even able to find an escape from his wife and from his problems, even with those guys. And so he decides, all right, I'm going to take my gun, I'll take my dog, and I'll go out squirrel hunting in the mountains, in the Catskill Mountains in New York State. All right. So he goes out into the mountains, and remember that he's this helpful guy, and he sees someone carrying a barrel, what appears to be a barrel of some sort of alcohol, up into the mountains. And this man is dressed very strangely, right? Very old-fashioned kind of clothing, right? So he helps the man, and the man leads him to this sort of area in the mountains, and he notices that there are a whole lot of other men with beards and older clothing, and they're playing, bowls and making lots of noise, and they offer him a drink, and he starts drinking with them and having lots of fun, and then he drinks so much that he passes out. All right? So that's the sort of the first half of the story, right? Then, without any warning to us as readers, he just naturally wakes up. Right? Where's my dog? I can't find my dog anywhere. Where's my gun? What's this weird, strangely it seems to have rusted overnight. Right? I suddenly have a long beard. Right? He's like, oh, well, I'm hungry. It was a long night. Goes down into the village. Everything still in the mountains still looks the same. But when he gets down into the village, of course, he finds that things have changed quite dramatically. No one that he knows is there anymore, right? None of the familiar faces. And they're all talking a very strange language about topics that he doesn't understand, about wars and elections and political parties and all sorts of things like that. And he then tells them who he is, and some of the older people, and of course some of his family too, come to recognize him as being the Rip Van Winkle, and of course it turns out that he has been asleep, not just for one night, but for 20 years, all right? Which explains why, the older people that he knew when he was living there, they're all dead now, well, most of them are, and all the young people that he was friends with have all grown up, and some of them obviously have moved away and married and so on. So then Rip Van Winkle settles down, and now he's happy because he's an old man and he's allowed to be lazy and to be idle and to be friendly and to tell stories and to do all the things that he did in his middle age that he wasn't supposed to be doing, but now is allowed to do because he's retired. Okay, so that's the surface of the story, right? So as we do, we're going to now investigate the deeper meanings, the underlying sort of ideas that Irving is trying to explore with this story. So as we've done before, we want to think about some of the context of who this author is, right? Where he's from, when the story was published, what are some of the things that might have influenced it. So we've already made a note of which country he's from. He's from America, right? So he's a very famous American writer. And what year was this story published? It's there in the syllabus. Anyone remember? (1819) is right, yes. Okay, so in 1819, and now this is where you'll say to me, but Peter, you told me last week that American Romanticism, the peak of that was the 1840s and 50s. Those famous writers like Nathaniel Hawthorne and Edgar Allan Poe and Herman Melville and Emerson and Thoreau and all the Dickinson, all these famous writers, American writers that are romantics, are much later in the century, right? And Washington Irving, as we can see, is a bit of an exception to that, and there's a reason for this. Right? So even though Washington Irving was born in America and he grew up and lived there for a long time, he nonetheless also traveled quite extensively. Right? And the place where he traveled the most was to Great Britain. Right? And so remember when we talked about the different times and different places where Romanticism was sort of reaching its peak and was in fashion in different places in the world, that it was in the early part of the 19th century and the late part of the 18th century that it was particularly popular in Great Britain, right? So people like William Wordsworth, right, were not only were becoming popular and becoming well known in this time, but Washington Irving actually got to meet William Wordsworth. And probably the writer that influenced him the most in terms of like giving him some ideas was the Scottish Romantic writer, Sir Walter Scott, right? And Sir Walter Scott is famous these days for having invented what we call the historical novel, right? Where he would take stories from history from way back, you know, usually from like stories, real historical stories from particularly the Middle Ages, right? So he tells a lot of stories about like knights and chivalry and so on, but he turns, Sir Walter Scott turns those stories of medieval knights into stories that actually have romantic heroes, right? He transforms the heroes of those stories into romantic thinkers and romantic characters, and romantic kinds of heroes, instead of the medieval heroes that they really were, right? So it's Scott in particular who inspires Irving to try his hand at telling and borrowing from some older traditions, right? So Irving is actually not only does he publish some of the best sort of early American Romantic writing, but also he was the first American author ever to actually earn his living completely from writing. He was the first professional writer, right? And this is because, precisely because he was able to straddle two markets at the same time, right? So he's able to sell his books in America and to appeal to Americans, but his books also appealed particularly to the British, right, and to some of the Europeans, right? So he's able to, because he was able to appeal to those two and also to draw from the culture of both of them, that he was able to appeal to a wider audience, earn more money, more respect, and make a bigger name for himself, right, than American authors had done previously. So he's not only is he like the first sort of American Romantic writer, but he's also very important within the history of American literature in general, just because of his success and his appeal across the board. So the book that this story comes from is, and you can see here that these are the two. The one on the left here is the book that this is from. You can see that's the old Penguin Classics. This is the slightly newer one, and you can see that they've thought, well, the original title is not as marketable. It won't sell as many copies. This one will sell more copies. So the original title there, it's hard to read, is the Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon, Gentleman, right? And you can see that they've retitled it as The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Other Stories, right? Because The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is a more famous title, even though it's just one of the titles of the stories, one of the stories in here, rather than the whole book, right? So they do tell you on the back that Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon is the real title, but this is the sort of the new, improved, as it were, title. Okay, so what's important about this to know is, first of all, the sketchbook has this idea that it's a series of, as you would expect, sketches, right? Which means like short stories and short observational pieces, right? So sometimes opinion pieces, sometimes short essays, other times stories, right? So they're just like if you were to look at a sketchbook by an artist, right, where they would just do like short sketches, short little drawings of things in the same way writers often do this kind of thing, particularly in the 19th century. This form is very popular, right? So, you know, Charles Dickens, for example, his very first book is a collection of sketches, right, of short pieces, observational pieces, some of them fictional, some of them detailing aspects of London society and so on, and they're collected in a book called Sketches by Boz, which was his early sort of pen name, right? Now, one of the things that Irving does, and again, this is another popular strategy in the 19th century, is that he uses what we call pen names or pseudonyms, or nom de plume is the French term that's also been borrowed into English. Basically, these are fake names, right? Made up names, right? That people publish under. Right? So sometimes it's done for various reasons, right? Sometimes people do it to hide their gender, right? So the very famous 19th century Victorian writer George Eliot, for example, you might think, George Eliot, that sounds like a man. Not a man, right? Actually, a woman, Mary Ann Evans, right? Sometimes people do it for other reasons, sometimes for political reasons, sometimes just because they think their name is boring, right? So George Orwell, right, which is not his real name. So there are various reasons why people do this. Right? In the case of Washington Irving, he's not doing it to hide his gender, because of course he picks male fake names, and he's already a man. And he doesn't do it for political reasons, he does it for the purpose of comedy. Right? He does it for the purpose of comedy. So this book that we have before us, the Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon Gentleman, right, is supposed to be a collection that has been put together and edited by this made-up character of Geoffrey Crayon, right? And as you can sort of see from the name, Geoffrey is a normal name, but Crayon sort of suggests that this is a sort of meant to be a silly name, right? You know, crayons are like the things that children use for coloring in, right? So Geoffrey Crayon, meant to be a sort of a silly name. He's given the title of gentleman to sort of make him seem more important than he really is, right? But overall, this is a strategy for comedy. And it also, what it allows Irving to do is to distance himself from the contents of what have been put into this book, right? So he's able to say, this guy, Geoffrey Crayon, he's an idiot, right? He's not a very smart guy, but you might find this book that he's put together interesting, right? It has all sorts of interesting stuff in there, but what a moron, right? And in turn, he does this with one other of his commonly used false names or pseudonyms, that of Diedrich Knickerbocker. All right. And you can see the book on the right there, also Penguin Classics, is called A History of New York. This was published 10 years before the story that we're looking at, and it is not a real history of New York, right? It's a satire of historical type documents, right? It's making fun of the way in which you might write a history. Okay? So this other character, Diedrich Knickerbocker, if you know, Geoffrey Crayon is sort of held up as being a sort of a fake gentleman, then Diedrich Knickerbocker is sort of, he's held up as being a fake scholar, right? As being someone who thinks that he's really smart, who's really good at history, that he's great at telling stories, and yet he's actually a fool and an idiot who doesn't really know what he's doing and doesn't know what he's talking about. Right? Now, of course, Irving is writing all of these characters, all of these pieces. So all of the stories in here are written by Washington Irving, but he attributes them to different characters, to different people. So most of them are put together by Geoffrey Crayon, but our particular story, right, and this is where if you look at the first page of our story, on page 6 of our reader, you'll notice that before the story begins, we have the first 3 paragraphs there. They begin with a square bracket in the first paragraph, and the end of the 3rd paragraph closes that square bracket, right? What that's meant to tell us is that this is a kind of introduction to the story, right? This is not part of the story itself. These are the notes of the editor, right? In other words, these parts here are the notes written by Geoffrey Crayon, right? Geoffrey Crayon. And from here is supposed to have been written by Diedrich Knickerbocker, right? Up until we get to this part on page 14, right? And we see there's a postscript, right, in which we're given a little note here, again by Geoffrey Crayon. He says, the following are traveling notes from a memorandum book of Mr. Knickerbocker, right? Okay, and so this note is from Geoffrey Crayon, and then the rest of it is taken from or using the notes from Diedrich Knickerbocker to explain certain aspects of the story. Okay. So notice that the way in which the author here plays with different voices, right? We saw that whenever we consider a work of literature, whenever we consider a story, we always need to think about the perspective that it's written from. Telltale Heart was written in what voice, what perspective? First person, and we saw that that first person narrator was very unreliable, right? We couldn't really trust what he was saying because what he was saying was so contradictory, right? We didn't really quite believe his rationalizations. This story is told, Rip Van Winkle, is it first person? No, it's what? Third person in this case, right? So in this case, a third person narrative seems more reliable, right? Seems less contradictory than what we saw in the Telltale Heart. But notice the way in which Irving uses these fake names, uses these different persona, different characters that he's created, right? And say, oh, okay, I'm writing as Geoffrey Crayon now. Oh, I'm writing this as Diedrich Knickerbocker. And in this way, he distances himself from these stories, right? So in that introduction, right, we're told that this guy, Diedrich Knickerbocker, famous for writing this, again, not real work, but a satirical work of the history of New York, right? That he is, sadly, he has died. Oh, how sad. Right? He never really existed, right? That he's died, and that this story of Rip Van Winkle was found amongst his papers, and that the editor, Geoffrey Crayon, thought it was interesting, and therefore he is including it here in his book of sketches. All right. Now, this is also a strategy to be aware of, and it's a strategy that is very popular in 18th century fiction in particular. And this is what we call using a found object or a found document, right? A document that you find that you say, oh, I bought a desk, this is often happens in the frame story of, say, a novel or a story. Is that, say, oh, I came across a desk, right? I bought it at an estate sale, right? I took it home with me, and I was writing, and then I noticed that there was some sort of like secret lever, and I pressed the lever, and bam, out popped all of these letters. What a surprise. And so I took these letters and I started reading them, and they were really interesting. And I thought, so everyone else should read these letters. And so I published them as this book of letters, right? Now, of course, the author has really just written all the letters himself or herself, right? But they pretend like, oh, I just found these, right? I just found this document, right? Or similarly, you can imagine someone says, oh, my grandmother died the other day, and she left me in her will, she left me some money, some jewelry, and this journal. And this journal tells of her stormy love affairs when she was a young woman, and it's so interesting that I think I should publish this journal, and you can all read it to find out this interesting story of her life. Again, the whole thing, the journal, everything has really been written by the author, but it's presented as a found object, right? So why would authors do this? Well, you know, what it does is it allows them to have some distance between themselves and the story that they're telling, right? They're allowed to sort of say, well, you know, I didn't write this, right? This really happened. It's sort of like the line in some TV programs, you know, based on a true story, right? When we know most of the time that like based on a true story means, well, they took a few things from a real story and the rest they made up, right? Very often, this is how those novels were too, right? So these strategies that we see Irving doing they are strategies to distance himself from the story that he's telling, from these characters that he's created, and it's mostly done for the sake of comedy, right? For making fun, in particular, of these characters, right? So the tone of these first three paragraphs is quite easy to miss. If you read them seriously, you're reading them incorrectly, because they're meant to be read with a great deal of irony and sarcasm, right? So we're told in that first paragraph that he's the late Diedrich Knickerbocker, so it means he's dead, right? Late is used as a polite way of saying that someone has died, right? And that he was an expert in Dutch history of the province, and also of lots of histories and stories and so on that he found interesting, and that he wrote a satire. Oh, sorry, he wrote a history, right? Which of course Irving is referring back to his earlier book. And when he says things like about this book, A History of New York, he says its chief merit, this is in the second paragraph, chief merit is its scrupulous accuracy. He's not being serious, right? Because he knows this was a joke book. This was a satire, right? So there are lots of things that are wrong or deliberate mistakes that are part of this book. And at the end of that same paragraph, he says, and it is now admitted into all historical collections as a book of unquestionable authority. All scholars read this and they think that it's a wonderful book. And of course, he is being completely sarcastic here. So in the third paragraph, he says some more things about Diedrich Knickerbocker. And again, they are meant to be taken tongue-in-cheek, sarcastically, not for real, right? Where he's talking, oh, what a great historian he was, right? He spent lots of time working on this history. Maybe he should have spent more time doing other things. But, okay, he spent his time doing this. And he says, he'll be famous forever because, he says, because the bakers have started imprinting his face on a certain kind of baked good, certain kind of biscuit that they've created, right? And of course, this is not going to make him famous, just as the other things like the Waterloo Medal or the Queen Anne's Farthing do not make you famous forever either, right? So the tone particularly of this beginning and end parts, the parts that are the editor's notes for this story, don't read them seriously, right? They're delivered with lots of irony, with lots of sarcasm, making fun of this Diedrich Knickerbocker as being an idiot, a fool, right? he's presented to us as this moron who is obsessed with like telling history and telling these stories, but that he got things constantly wrong, you know, and we're even told, and this is maybe another reason for why he uses these pseudonyms, we're even told that towards the end of the story, if we look on page 14 here, right after the note, again, this part here is written by Jeffrey Crayon, where he tells us, the foregoing tale, right, the story that you've just read about Rip Van Winkle, one would suspect had been suggested to Mr. Knickerbocker by a little German superstition about the Emperor Frederick de Rothbart, and that's actually a typo there, it should be Kiffhauser Mountain. The subjoined note, however, which had appended to the tale, shows that it is an absolute fact, narrated with his usual fidelity. Now, again, it's being sarcastic here, right? It tells us that basically Diedrich Knickerbocker, he's saying, ripped off this story from an old German story, right? He stole this, he plagiarized basically this story of Rip Van Winkle, right? And actually, when we look at this story, we'll find out in a moment that that's actually what Washington Irving really did. But he's playfully admitting to it here and saying, oh, it's because it was written by Diedrich Knickerbocker. He was an idiot, right? He was a fool, right? But here he uses it as a way of excusing or distancing himself from having stolen this story. Okay, so this particular story that is being referenced is a German folktale that after his meeting with Walter Scott and discussing like the use of history and the past and so on in stories, Washington Irving had taught himself some basic German so that he could actually go and read some German folktales in the original. Right? A lot of stuff now, of course, has been translated into English, but back in those times, there weren't as many translations, and so you often, if you wanted to read something in another language, most of the time you had to go and learn the language. So he did learn some basic German, and the story that he actually rips off in particular is that called Peter Klaus. Right? And Peter Klaus, if you read the story, you can find it online. It is almost the same story as Rip Van Winkle, right? Except it's in Germany, and it's about a goat herd, right? Someone who looks after goats, who is, you know, out in the fields with his goats one day, wonders, my goats seem to be disappearing into strange places. I wonder where they're going. And so he follows them one day, and then the same thing happens in the Rip Van Winkle story. He comes across a group of strange men from the past, right? Although in his case they seem to be, I think, as I remember, German knights, right? And they're all drinking and playing bowls. You can see the picture there, right? So this is from an illustration of the story of Peter Klaus. And in the story, he then drinks with them, plays bowls with them, and he falls asleep and wakes up 20 years later, and society has greatly changed in that time, right? Now, of course, you know, there's been many, many other stories well before these German folk stories about like people sleeping for a long, long time and other sorts of metaphors like that. But this is obviously direct inspiration for Irving's story in Rip Van Winkle. Okay, so that's where he borrows from. And I also said to you in our very first class, and this is really true of all of Irving's stories, is that the Romantic writers were often fascinated by folk tales, right? And also they tended to use them to create a sort of a Gothic sort of setting. Remember we said that the Gothic uses setting and atmosphere to create certain feelings, to create certain moods in the way that we think about the story and the way in which the characters think, right? So in this case, of course, we have the mountains are the setting for this, and then this uncanny encounter with these people, ghosts as it were, from the past. Now, that's not to say that Washington Irving just simply ripped off this story and told it in exactly the same way. He adds some new things, some different things to the story that are quite important for how we understand it, and he resets it closer to his time period. Right? This guy here, I mean, this is actually not even a real historical sketch. We don't have any real paintings or pictures of him. It's a guy called Henry Hudson. You ever been to New York City? Yep. The river that you cross from New Jersey into New York City is called the what river? The Hudson River, right? And that's because it was first discovered by Europeans through this guy, Henry Hudson. Now, he's not actually Dutch, even though his name is, he's given a Dutch name in our story here at Winkle. He's actually English, but he, at the time that he made these voyages, right, sailed up the Hudson River that was given his name, he was working for the Dutch East India Company, right? So he was actually working for this Dutch company, and so it was eventually the Dutch who actually first settled the area in and around what we now know as New York City, most of New Jersey, parts of eastern Pennsylvania, parts of Connecticut, and just sort of a big band there around where New York City is. And so that was originally settled by the Dutch, right? We tend to think of like the US as because of the, you know, particularly because of the wars and so on, as being primarily a British colony, right? It's now English speaking, et cetera, but there were several different European powers that colonized different parts of what is now the United States, right? So, yeah, some of those original colonies, they were British, right? So the Plymouth Pilgrims and so on from Great Britain, but the Dutch, they also settled in that part that is now New York City and its surrounding areas, and that was eventually, as we'll see in a moment, taken over by the British, that area, right? That's why it's called New York, right? And York is, you know, part of England, right? And sort of if you look at the rest of the United States, what is now the United States, the central part there was French, right? Sold by Napoleon to raise money for his wars, sold to the United States during Napoleon's time, and then much of the west part was under Spanish or Mexican rule, right? So it was settled by those people, and most of those states became part of the United States during the Mexican-American War in 1848, right? So this gradual sort of westward expansion of the United States. So in the 17th century, the 1600s, the Dutch had colonized this area. And the last of the Dutch governors of New York City was the guy who is mentioned in our story, historical figure there on the left, a painting of him, that's Peter Stuyvesant, right? And so he was sort of famous for being the last of those Dutch governors, of being a pretty, even though he's like resisted the British militarily in various ways, nonetheless was given credit for handing over in a relatively peaceful and successful way to the British eventually. And you can see here, this is a map of what was called New Netherlands, right? This was the Dutch settlement. This is around 1660 is this map represents, right? You can see here Long Island, New York City, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, New York State here, so and the little parts of the Connecticut and so on. So this was the settlement here. And actually, if you go to New York, there are lots of the famous names of neighborhoods and so on are originally actually Dutch names, right? So Harlem, for example, right? is a Dutch word. So this history of the area, right, that's being described is like, it's taking place somewhere around here, right, where Rip Van Winkle is living. Of course, he's not living in a specified village, but we're told that he's living near the Catskill Mountains, which are spelt in the old-fashioned, more Dutch sort of way in our story as well, right? And that there is this sort of the Dutch way of life, the Dutch colonial way of life, right, that he experiences. What is it like? It's very peaceful, right? It's very laid back, right? The stories and the news items that are being discussed by the men at the inn, right? Are they new news items? Do they just happen? No, one of the kind of the implied jokes about what they're talking about is that the news that they're reading, right, is from newspapers that are like months old, right? They're way behind the times, behind the fashions, behind everything, right? And so this little village, it's peaceful, but it's very backward, very calm. Nothing really much happens there, right? And so this is how the old United States, the pre-revolutionary United States is characterized. Okay? So one of the things that we see that happens, well, what does happen in those 20 years when Rip is asleep? Yes, the American Revolution, right? Which is when the British colonies, right, decided that they were no longer going to be part of the British Empire, so they seceded from the empire. They fought a war with Great Britain, okay, and they then became the independent republic of the United States of America, right? So this is quite a big thing to miss. If you go to sleep one day and you're in a quiet, lazy, laid back, old-fashioned Dutch town that's been the same way for a couple of hundred years, right? And then you wake up 20 years later and you walk into town and you're like, what did I miss? What happened? Anything? Right? And something has happened, as we said, the American Revolution, right? In which the whole culture of the place and the country and the village, in Rip's particular case, seems to have changed. Right? So what are these people like now when he returns, when Rip returns? What are they like? Are they still quiet and peaceful and laid back? No, right? They're energized and they're combative and they're suspicious, right? They're like, oh, who's this guy with a gun? Right? Oh, he supports the king, right? And this is, of course, is something that is also easily forgotten about this revolutionary time, is that, like, even though July 4th, everyone celebrates Independence Day in America and so on, in the colonies at the time of the revolution, there were lots of people who didn't support seceding from Great Britain, right? And there were thousands of people who left the United States because they didn't agree or they didn't believe in the independent republic. So at that time, there were a lot of people who didn't agree with the revolution, even though, of course, we now see it as fait accompli. That's historical hindsight, right? It was much more controversial at the time than we see it now. So we see this symbolized for us by this drastic change that seems to happen in American society and American culture before the revolution to after the revolution, symbolized for us particularly by two things that Rip sees, right? And I've illustrated them, giving you two pictures of them up there on page 8. Right? the guys who gather together at the inn, right, and discuss current events and are sort of like the old men, wise sages of the village, right? Above above where they sit, there is, in the middle of that second paragraph, it says, there is a rubicund portrait of His Majesty George III, right? This would be the King of Britain, right? George III, you can see there on the left, right? So above them, above these guys, the old-fashioned way is symbolized by the monarch, right? This king who sits above where the old men are talking. But when Rip comes back on page 11, right? And remember, he's now an old man, so he sort of, you know, he's like, he can't see as well, his bones sort of creak, his muscles aren't working as well, you know, he's gotten old, right? And he looks around and he's like, oh, well, they still have the portrait of the king. He looks a little bit different. He's changed his coat color, right? And who is it? George Washington, right? So it's not actually the king anymore, it's now the president, right? Now, this is a bit of, you know, sort of cynicism, if you like, a bit of sarcasm about, on Irving's part, about, on the one hand, he shows the way in which there can be drastic changes that happen in society. In other ways, he's also suggesting that there are certain things about humans that don't change, right? Or certain things about society that don't easily change. So even though he sees that like there are some slight differences, right? Remember the army uniform of the British was what color? Ah, the red coats are coming, right? It was red, okay? So famously, they're often referred to as the redcoats. So the Americans wore blue, right? So that's why in the two pictures, he says, oh, George III, in the old picture, he used to always wear red. And now, remember, he's looking, he's sort of short-sighted. Oh, now he's changed. He looks a bit different, but he's wearing a blue coat, right? So the suggestion is that, well, you know, certain things have changed in America, but not everything has really changed. Right? Maybe a king, change from a king to a president, maybe not. Irving is sort of cynically suggesting maybe not as big as you think. They're still called George. There's still, like, so there's this suggestion here that there are certain things that change and certain things that maybe don't really change a whole lot. Okay. Now, one of the central symbols that I want to talk about before we begin our discussion through our prep sheets is that with regard to the Catskill Mountains, and of course we saw in our very first class about the different three major themes of Romanticism. Which one would this connect to? Nature, right. Okay. And we saw that there are two sides to nature that the Romantics tend to explore. One side tends to be the way in which nature can be nurturing and helpful and caring, right? Sort of Mother Nature view of things. But more commonly, what we see is that second word there, the idea of the sublime, right? The sublime, right? And remember we said that the sublime is a feeling, right, that's not possible really to express in words, right? That's part of what the sublime is, because it's too powerful, too difficult to express. But it's also a feeling that particularly nature gives us through its size and power that makes us feel small as human beings, right? Now, normally, this is done through like showing, you know, sort of natural disasters and so on in romantic fiction. So an earthquake or a snowstorm or a shipwreck or any of those kinds of things tends to be like, whoa, I'm just a I'm just one guy here on this ship, and my ship is being tossed around by these huge waves. I have no power over my destiny. It's up to nature really whether I live or die, right? I feel very small. And certainly the way in which the mountains are presented to us, particularly at the beginning of the story, when we're told that they look over the village and their mood, right? When the weather is nice and beautiful and happy, like everyone feels good in the town, and when the weather is bad, it's sort of like it creates these sort of like more negative sort of feelings, right, in the town, right? So the mountains, certainly because of their huge size, are given to make us feel small as human beings, or make the characters feel small. But the other way, the more important way, is through Irving's use of the idea of time, right? Now, within the context of a human life, would we normally want to give up 20 years of our life? Would you feel a bit cheated if you fell asleep one day and you woke up and it was 20 years later and you'd miss those 20 years? You'd be like, that's a lot of my life to miss, right? You go from being, in Rip's case, being middle-aged to being an old man and not having any experience or remembering any of those years, right? So we notice that. But look what happens when Rip wakes up, right? This is on page 10. On waking, he found himself on the green knoll whence he had first seen the old man of the glen. He rubbed his eyes. It was a bright sunny morning. The birds were hopping and twittering among the bushes, and the eagle was wheeling aloft and breasting the pure mountain breeze. Surely, thought Rip, I have not slept here all night. He recalled the occurrences before he fell asleep, the strange man with the keg of liquor, the mountain ravine, the wild retreat among the rocks, the woebegone party at Ninepins, the flagon. Oh, that flagon, that wicked flagon, thought Rip. What excuse shall I give to Dame Van Winkle? All right? So here he is. We don't know yet that 20 years have passed at this point in the story, do we? He's just woken up. He looks around him. It's 20 years have passed. Does the mountain look any different? Doesn't, does it? Right? So in a human life, 20 years seems to us a long time, a lot of lived time to miss out on if it was to be taken out of our lives. In the life of a mountain, the life of a mountain, I mean, mountains aren't alive, but in the time that a mountain exists, is 20 years a long time? No, right? So when he wakes up, it seems to him like nothing looks any different, right? Like there's still, the same bushes and the same glen and the same area, right? And the mountains of course exist for thousands and sometimes even millions of years. Right? And so this is that idea of the sublime, right, that we get. When we compare how long a mountain exists to even the longest of human lifetimes, we think, wow, my life is pretty short. Even if I live 100 years, I'm not going to this mountain will still be around hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years from now, right? So we get this feeling, that is that feeling of the sublime that is included here in this story. Okay. Jan.
I thought the first passage on page 9 was interesting.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and why is that?
It describes about Rip spending his time just looking at the nature.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought the expression, the mountains began to throw their long blue shadows over the valleys, was interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Because it shows how the time is passing in this specific moment.
Yes. Yes. Also, what does this sort of project onto the mountains? Can mountains really, are they alive?
No.
Can they think?
No.
Can they have intentions?
So the writer is giving life?
Yeah, he's almost giving them a kind of like personality, isn't he? Now, we've seen that that's not real, but there's this sort of this sense, right? This symbolic sense in which Rip like starts to imagine this. Because of course, in folk tales, this can happen, right? And of course, you know, like there are these magical elements that are borrowed for this particular story. It is not, it has certain elements that are realistic, right? But it has certain other elements that are not. Can you really sleep without any, you know, life support system or anything for 20 years? No, of course not, right? So can you really meet the ghosts of the Dutch ancestors in the Catskill Mountains? No, right? So there are these, on the one hand, we're given this sort of this realistic story, right? It appears realistic at the beginning and at the end, but the things that happen in the middle of the story, right, are borrowed from those folk tales, right? So we sort of have this mixture of the real with the fantasy. And so we see that happening in this passage as well, right? Where Rip starts to imagine things. He starts to imagine, oh, the shadows of the mountains. Oh, the mountains are deliberately doing this to me. Oh, there's this, they're starting to call out my name, right? Where he hears, you know, someone calling his name, but he can't tell who it is. And also within that scene, he also, what does he see? He sees a kind of bird. What kind of bird? Crow, right? And remember we saw, like we talked about symbolism the last couple of classes, right? And how symbols, of course, are used not for literal purposes, but for evoking emotions, ideas. And a crow is often associated with what? Sometimes with death, but also with bad luck, right? Or something, you know, something momentous is going to happen, right? Misfortune, yes, right? So that's what he sees here. Now, of course, all those things are entirely imaginary, and I also pointed out previously, this word fancy that's used in the third line of that paragraph is also an important one in a lot of romantic fiction. We saw it, it was also there in Telltale Heart. It means the imagination, right? Fancy, what you imagine is happening, right? It's not a term that we use in this sense in modern English anymore, but in romantic fiction it's used all the time, right? And it's, your imagination can create these sorts of supernatural effects where you think a mountain is calling to you, where you think, oh, wait, there's a crow, oh, something bad is going to happen, you know, and those kinds of things that can affect your mind and make you start to see different things. Okay. Let's see. Charlie?
I think page 13. Page 13.
Page 13?
Yeah, last one paragraph.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because the author said that Rick he still resumed his old works and habits. So I think maybe the revolution has brought a little change to common villagers' life.
Yes.
Yeah, because there would be many people like Rick. They have no interest in politics. They knew a little bit about politics.
Yes.
I don't think their life really changed because of the revolution.
Yes. Yep. So there are these certain things that obviously we see have changed about America when he returns, and particularly because the day on which he returns is a sort of a particularly controversial day for the people because it's election day, right? So they're all like, who are you going to vote for? Like, you know, what's going to happen in the election, right? But that goes back to what I was saying earlier about like how Irving says, well, there are certain things that change about our world and certain things that don't change quite so easily or so quickly, right? And so you're right, we see in this passage, we see that even though Rip Van Winkle, he comes back into this new town, there's new ideas, there's new political regime. It's gone from being a British colony to now being, you know, the United States of America and, you know, the first sort of modern democratic republic. Nonetheless, as a common man, it doesn't really affect his life all that much, right? He does the same things, he goes to the same places, and if we skip down to the very bottom, the last line there, we're told about how Rip, in fact, was no politician, right? He wasn't interested in current affairs. The changes of states and empires made but little impression on him, right? And of course, here we see that, you know, really, we're seeing Rip as being sort of like the everyday common man, like the guy who is not involved in politics, who is not that kind of, you know, misfit, superior or inferior kind of romantic hero, right? You know, usually the misfit either is too far beyond or too far below society to fit in, right? But Rip Van Winkle, he turns out to be an ordinary guy. He's not, in the end, he's not really cut out to be a romantic hero, right? And this is one of the things that, that is quite interesting about Washington Irving, is that even though he often uses and flirts with and plays around with romantic ideas and romantic themes in his stories, he also often undercuts them, right? He gives us a story that could be a really over-the-top romantic story, but then the kind of character that he chooses, right, is too ordinary, too kind of, you know, everyman, boring, common, to be the kind of extraordinary hero that we expect from a romantic story, right? So here, as I said, Irving is a little bit different when it comes to thinking about our romantic characters because he doesn't have those kinds of extremes like we saw in The Telltale Heart, right? He's not that kind of extreme character, okay? Yes, so we start to see strange things start to happen in that paragraph. So we noted the shadows, the calling voice, the crow. What does he see then right after that? Who appears?
A small man.
Right, this small man. And how is he dressed?
Dutch fashion.
Yeah, he's dressed in old-fashioned Dutch clothing, right? So, you know, even though, you know, Rip is living in this, you know, village that is like descended from, you know, Dutch inhabitants and so on, and he's used to some aspects of that. These are like old-fashioned, right? Really out of date, really old-fashioned. So he helps the man because he's Rip Van Winkle, and we've seen that like this is sort of what he does, right? He doesn't do his own work. He goes out and helps everyone else, right? Instead of focusing on his own farm and his own household, right? And he helps the man, but notice he's sort of like, he doesn't say anything when he helps him carry the barrel up. He's just like, oh, let me give you a hand with that. And then they're walking along, but they walk in silence. And Rip is just like, this is kind of weird. I don't really want to say anything, but oh, I'll help him, right? And this is sort of like the way in which he approaches it, is that he just, who is this guy? I can't really ask him. It'd be strange, right? So this is how he proceeds through the story. Could be seen as symbolic of the relationship between Great Britain and its American colony, right? Is that sort of like the Great Britain was like a bossy wife always telling what to do, and then eventually the colony in history terms rebels, but of course we don't see that within this story. But yes, certainly that's the way some critics have interpreted that part of the story, right? Is that the relationship between Rip and his wife could be read as being symbolic or representing the relationship between Great Britain and its American colony. So very domineering, very unfair, very, always pushing it. Saying, oh, you're not good enough. Right? You must do this, you must do that, etc. To close, since we're almost out of time, I also want you to note another sort of element of this story that we're being introduced to that is very common in a lot of romantic fiction, and that is of what we call a double, or borrowing from the German word, the Doppelganger, right, is where you have someone who is your exact double or looks just like you, right? So when Rip comes back to town, who looks just like him? His son, right? So his son, remember, they're like, oh, you're Rip Van Winkle? No, you're not Rip Van Winkle. There's Rip Van Winkle. And he looks over and he's like, that does look like me, right? The guy looks exactly like me. He has the same character, he has the same posture, he's leaning against a tree, right? Everything about him suggests to him. And we're even told on page 13 that his son, Rip's son and heir, who was the ditto of himself, right? Ditto means like same, right? So exactly the same as himself. So in this case, we have an explanation for why there is someone who looks exactly like him. It's because it's his son. But sometimes certainly in some of the more supernatural kind of stories that we'll come across as well, there is, and we will actually close, our final story will be about a doppelganger story, a double story, in which we have two people who inexplicably look exactly the same, have the same name, the same birthday, everything about them is exactly the same. And the way in which the romantic authors use that as symbolic as well, right? Of our different sides, different parts of our personality that can be split into two characters. All right, so thank you guys for next time. We'll be reading Balzac's The Elixir of Life, right? Rather gruesome little story. And so as you leave, please hand in your prep sheets, and I'll see you on Tuesday. Thank you.